Today, we're diving into one of the biggest, and let's be honest, most controversial economic shakeups in modern India, the new labor codes. So are they the key to supercharging India's economy, or are they a huge step back for worker protections? Let's get into it.
Right off the bat, you can see the two sides of this story. On one hand, the government is selling this as a win-win, a modernizing move that's great for everybody. But on the other hand, trade unions are seriously worried. They see these codes as a way to make it much easier for companies to hire and, more importantly, fire people.
But look, before we get into the nuts and bolts of the new rules, we really have to understand what they're replacing. Because the old system, well, it was a mess. Pretty much everyone agreed it was broken and needed a complete overhaul.
So the foundation of the old system was built on 29 separate central government acts. And a lot of these laws were old, like really old. They were written for a totally different India, long before globalization and the modern economy. And those 29 acts, well, they created this absolute spiderweb of over 10,000 different rules and regulations. They would overlap, sometimes they even contradict each other. It was just a bureaucratic nightmare for businesses. And for workers, it was impossible to figure out what their rights actually were. And this just gives you a taste of what a headache it was. To stay on the right side of the law, a single business might have to deal with at least 180 different forms. This wasn't just annoying for companies, it made the whole system so complicated that it was basically impossible for a regular worker to navigate.
So the government's answer to all this chaos was pretty radical. The plan was to basically tear down that old, tangled structure and replace it with just 4 new, simplified codes that are actually built for the 21st century.
And these are the 4 pillars of that new system. The idea is that they cover, the whole shebang of the employer-employee relationship. Everything from your paycheck and your right to unionize, to your Social Security and, of course, your safety at work. Okay, so what's the big sales pitch here? Let's look at the good stuff. The promised benefits that supporters say these codes are going to bring to the table for everyone. And you gotta admit, on paper, some of this looks really good. Things get way simpler for businesses. Every single worker is supposed to get an appointment letter and pay slips. And, this is a big one, gig and platform workers, your delivery drivers and app-based workers, are finally getting legal recognition. Plus, things like getting your gratuity after just 1 year on a fixed contract instead of 5, that's a clear win. But for every positive, there seems to be a pretty big concern. So now let's flip the coin and look at the other side, the things that have trade unions protesting all across the country. Okay, this one is at the heart of the debate. It seems a little technical, but it has huge implications. It's the new definition of wages. The law now says your basic pay has to be at least 50% of your total salary, and that's going to directly change how much money you take home. So here's the trade-off. Because your Provident Fund contribution is based on your basic pay, a higher basic pay means more money goes into your retirement fund. That's the upside. The downside? Well, for a lot of people, it means a smaller paycheck every month, because more of your salary is getting deducted right away.
Now this is probably the most controversial change in the entire package. The threshold for when a company needs government permission to lay off workers has been tripled. That means companies with up to 299 employees can now downsize without getting a green light from the government. Unions see this as a direct attack on job security.
The power of workers to organize and protest is also being changed in a big way. The rule about giving notice before a strike, that now applies to every single industry. And get this, even something like mass casual leave, where more than half the workers call in sick, is now legally considered a strike. On top of that, new rules for negotiating might push smaller unions to the sidelines.
And then there's a really deep fear about working hours. Okay, so the weekly limit is 48 hours. But the codes also allow for a workday of up to 12 hours. Critics are warning that this creates a dangerous loophole. It could be used to push for incredibly long work weeks, even if that 48-hour weekly cap is technically still there.
So, after all that, what are we supposed to think? When you put the potential economic benefits on one side of the scale and the very real worries about worker rights on the other, where does the balance tip for India's massive workforce? This quote really gets to the heart of the criticism. India's founders talked about a living wage, enough money to have a stable, decent life. But critics say that even with these new reforms, we're still just talking about a minimum wage, which for millions of people is only enough to survive, not really enough to live. At the end of the day, a law is only as good as how it's put into practice. And we've seen this before in India with other huge reforms, like the GST. The road from a good idea on paper to something that actually works in the real world,
Well, it can be pretty long and bumpy. And that really brings us to the final multi-billion-dollar question. Are these reforms going to create a ton of new, desperately needed jobs? Or are they just going to make work more precarious and less secure for the millions of people who already have jobs? The answer to that is going to define the future of work for a whole generation of Indians.